In the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs, I'm also the co-director of the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies, which is one of the organizations who are sponsoring today's event, along with the Center for International Strategy, Technology and Policy, and the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering. I'm delighted to be able to introduce General Philip Breedlove, who is the newest addition to our faculty. He's a distinguished professor in the Sam Nunn School and as a senior fellow in the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies. Philip Breedlove is a highly decorated retired general of the US Air Force, where he reached the highest levels of military leadership as Supreme Allied Commander Europe, SACEUR, and Commander of US European Command. During 39 years of service following his graduation from Georgia Tech in civil engineering, he served in a variety of demanding command and staff positions, leading large-scale, diverse global operations across 2 theaters of combat and earning a reputation as an outstanding leader. Leading a diverse political military alliance, he built consensus to accomplish complex tasks spanning multiple continents. He answered directly to NATO's governing body, the North Atlantic Council, to the President of the United States, and to the Secretary of Defense. He led the most comprehensive and strategic structural and policy security challenges in the alliance's 70-year history. His diplomatic skills reassured allies, deterred potential aggressors, and maintained alliance unity during the most dynamic and challenging period of the alliance's inception. Please join me in welcoming General Breedlove.
You listen to those things, you always ask yourself, who is he talking about? Most important thing I'll say to you all is I'm really glad to be back here. You cannot imagine how proud I am to be a graduate of this great institution. And to be asked to come back and be a part of the faculty is icing on the cake. This morning I spoke to a group of about 14 PhDs and Senator Nunn, and I felt like I was defending my thesis again. But it was a lot of fun. So what are we going to do today? We have about an hour. I really want to just talk for about 25 minutes, and then we'll get to the most important part of what we're going to do today, which is field your questions. And I'll answer any question you want to ask. If it's political, I'll defer. I've remained apolitical in this season, and I will do that into the future. But I look forward to having an interchange with you at the end. So what I'm not going to do today in this session is go through every little problem going on in Europe. If you're reading the papers, you're probably fairly up to date on those. I will touch a few of the most important, and it will relate to what was on the first slide, which is I really want to talk about a way ahead in a couple of places. What you have in front of you, of course, is sort of a map of the European continent and picking up portions of Africa, which is important. And what this map should show to you is there are a lot of flashpoints, and we'll discuss some of those. But in the EU parlance and in NATO words, we talk broadly, we is a bad personal pronoun, I'm retired now, they talk broadly about 2 grand challenges. 2 grand challenges, and in the typical military fashion, we labeled them with pretty boring names. Strategic direction east and strategic direction south. And this speaks to 2 problem sets that really were beginning to divide NATO. As we came out of Afghanistan, we were looking at what NATO is going to be about. What is the raison d'etre? I'm terrible in French, that's as good as it gets. But what is the raison d'etre now in NATO? And of course, we have small nations that used to be in the Warsaw Pact in the north, very worried about their sort of restless neighbor to the east. And then we have nations in the south that were beginning to feel the leading edge of refugee and immigrant problems that were bringing great societal changes to them. And these 2 directions, east and south, at that time, when I first became the SACEUR 3 years ago, really were sort of disconnected. There wasn't a lot of connective tissue. We'll talk a little bit about the special case of Turkey in a few minutes. But these two issues were disconnected. Later, as you all know, Russia moved into Syria, and the two now are connected in a very big way, and the discussion is even more mature about how to move forward in these two strategic problems. So just broadly, we'll speak to a few here in a minute. Some would ask, what's this bolt doing out here in the Atlantic Ocean? What is that all about? Well, great concern, first brought forward by the Europeans, second brought forward by us Americans, because of the change in the status of Russian forces in the Atlantic and the Med, and the presence almost routinely of larger maneuver groups out of the Russian Navy and their aircraft. We have all come to the conclusion that the last unopposed crossing of the Atlantic has passed. In the future, if we were ever, God forbid, to have a conflict with Russia, we expect that the crossing of the Atlantic will be opposed. We have never built a military force since World War II to face an opposed crossing of the Atlantic. And so we have to think again about how we would move troop ships and aircraft into the European airspace and sea space if we needed it. So that's the bolt out in the ocean. I've been asked, is that lost? Was it just a mistake or whatever? And that's what that is. But the rest of these you're fairly familiar with. The Baltic Sea here in the north and the enclave oblast of Kaliningrad and what is happening there. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Of course, in the north, our neighbors there are very concerned. We'll talk about them in just a minute. Eastern Ukraine and the peninsula of Crimea, Georgia and Turkey. And then the bolt in the Mediterranean is talking to the entire northern coast of the continent of Africa and the migratory flows there. The places that we see Daesh, that's ISIL, ISIS, I call them Daesh. We see them now in many places in North Africa and causing the problems there. So this is a broad sort of laydown of the individual points inside of these two strategic directions. So, in order to start first on a positive note, because it will get less positive across the next several slides, we see the Northern Sea Route as a great opportunity with Russia. I'm going to sort of start in the north and work my way all the way to Africa with these slides. Whether you believe in climate change or not, what is actually happening along the northern coast of Russia, of course, is that the ice has changed, and now we see maybe even 3 months and a week, and it grows a little every year, of navigable movement along the north coast of Russia. Now, what does this do? I've heard as few as 14 days and as many as 21 days diminishing in the transit time for goods from Northern Europe to the Asia-Pacific region. So it's 14 to 21 days, according to which sailor you listen to. Shorter route from Northern Europe around to the markets in Asia for goods. That, for those who understand, makes a lot of difference in cost or savings and opportunity on ship movement along that northern shore. This is an opportunity. If you listen to two of our great partners in the north and our allies in the north along the Arctic region, they're very concerned of what they're seeing happening along this route. Airfields being refurbished and refit, ports being refurbished and refit. One would say maybe that's for good. Search and rescue, etc., except for that the context of this refit along this route is almost in every case, first a military context, second a commercial context. So there's great concern among our northern allies and two of our great partners in the north for what they think is a militarization of this opportunity. Later in my conversation, as we get to what I really want to talk about, which is a way forward, we're going to be looking for opportunities, and I think this is one of the opportunities that could be taken in a future conversation. As we come down the map, the next are the, as I call them, the 3 Bs, the Baltic nations and Poland. Very concerning here. For some time, the issue of SNAP exercises, militarization of the Western District, and all of these nations clearly understand their vulnerability. And you see played out every day in the paper now, NATO's response or lack of response, or the ability to respond versus the lack of the ability to respond in the North. If you have followed closely the Russian press, it's not really out there in the Western press too much, but it's certainly in the intelligence. In the Western Military District opposing Poland and the 3 Bs, there is a rebuilding of the 1st Guards Tank Army. And for those of you who understand history, that carries a really bad connotation for the folks there. And I think that's clearly sort of a publicity thing on what's happening. They're clearly changing their military stance there. But to label it the 1st Guards Tank Army would clearly be sort of an offensive play. The last thing to talk to is the Kaliningrad Oblast or enclave, and as you follow recently, the pronunciations that they're considering or have moved nuclear weapons into that enclave will be a great concern for our partners in the North. Crimea, these are the infamous little green men as we labeled them in NATO. I got a cup, by the way, from my counterpart in Russia. After they denied the little green men were theirs for years and years, or not years and years, but months and months, we held that they were Russians. As I was leaving, I got a cup from Mr. Gerasimov that said, "We love our little green men," in Russian on it. So these guys become very famous, and I would like to talk about here is not the little green men, but that they were the end of what I think was a soft takeover. Some label this hybrid warfare. In the U.S., we like to call it unconventional warfare, and I've started writing about what I call war below the lines, war below the threshold at which a nation responds. In some nations, that threshold is very high. In some nations, that threshold is very low. I think in Crimea, what we saw was a relatively bloodless takeover because this hybrid war had gone to the point where they had already bought off all the people in utilities, all the people in telecom, all the senior military leadership outside of the Ukrainian post, all the police, etc., etc. The only people that weren't bought off at the beginning when this thing went down were the Tartars, the Crimean Tartars, and the Ukrainian military, and so it made it pretty easy. So this hybrid war, I think, had gone to the point where the world actually wanted to believe that these were not Russians, right up until Mr. Putin said, "Yeah, it's us." What's going on in the Donbass is still terribly concerning. The Minsk process to this point really has not elicited what I would call any measurable goodness. Very little has come from Minsk. In general, a cessation of the tougher hostilities along the line of contact. But as I spoke to the Deputy Prime Minister just about 8-9 days ago, she reminds that every day people are dying there. Soldiers are dying, shells are flying. Why is that important? It's a very low level. It really doesn't make the news much anymore. But why is it important? I think it's important for the following reason. Remember what the Maidan was all about. It was about getting rid of a crooked leader and making the government responsive to the people and making them reform and make reforms. I think that Mr. Putin understands very clearly that as long as he can keep the Ukrainian army in the field along the line of contact, that every ounce of extra money and a lot of money that will be borrowed that Ukraine will spend will be to keep that army in the field to defend along the line of contact. And that means that he has less money and less time to apply himself Mr. Poroshenko and his government to making the changes that the Maidan demanded. So if Mr. Putin can keep that army in the field, keep the government stalled in its response to the Maidan, then the youth and the people of Ukraine will probably vote this government out as well. And Mr. Putin would hope to find a more pliable group in next, I would think. So why is this important that it's still warm and not hot, but warm and not cold? I think it's a very calculated effort by Russian leadership to keep the Ukrainian army in the field so that they are unable to respond to the changes that their voting electorate called for in the Maidan movement. So the last of sort of the eastern part of this is the Black Sea. Why is this important? The Black Sea is an opportunity, again, for everybody from Georgia in the east around to Greece, Bulgaria, Romania in the west. An opportunity, a place where free exchange of trade, free movement of goods and services would be incredibly important. No one is saying that there's a great impetus or a great stoppage of that trade or movement now, but what we have seen out of the Crimean Peninsula is the creation of offensive capabilities by the Russians that control about 44% of the airspace of the Black Sea and control about 94% of the navigable sea space in the Black Sea. So the surface defense cruise missiles, the air defense cruise missiles range about half and about 94%. You saw that the missiles that were fired from the Caspian and other places in a land attack mode, the entire NATO airspace and land space is threatened at this point. So what has happened is clearly Mr. Putin has made a clear statement that Russia will have to be dealt with in any actions in the Black Sea. Okay, so before we leave this slide, I want to talk just a little bit to strategic direction east. If you remember the title slide, it's about what's ahead. We can all admire this problem. There's a whole list of problems here we could admire and watch change, get worse or better. Really, what is it we do as we move forward? Here's my approach. One or two of you have heard this, so I apologize. You can take a nap. Here's my approach. Our nation uses a mantra about Europe. It says that we wish for Europe whole, free, and at peace. That comes out of our strategy, etc. I agree with that. Whole, free, and at peace is a good start. I would add at the end of that, and prosperous. Why is prosperous important? Think of the societal challenges in Europe and the societal challenges in the arc of instability to the south of Europe that are spilling over into Europe. All of the pressures on our great allies, big ones like France and Great Britain and Germany, and small ones like Hungary and Greece and others. Think of the great pressures being put on these nations by these problems in the south. We can address those problems better if the nations of Europe are prosperous. There's more money for societal pressures, meeting the demands of our society, and for providing security. Here's the part that makes people bristle. I believe that a prosperous Europe is easier with Russia than without Russia. If we are competing with Russia, that is a problem. If we are fighting openly with Russia, that is a huge problem. We will not find ourselves prosperous in that way. Ergo, I believe we need to find whatever it is in the future, a relationship. Maybe that word is too strong. Remember that in the 90s and the early 2000s, we were trying to make a partner out of Russia. That was the word we were using. We wanted a partnership. And in 2008, when they went into Georgia, we got past that, thinking this is a burp, This is not good, but we'll get past it. And we'll try once again to make a partner out of Russia and move forward. I think that from what we saw in Crimea, what we've seen in Donbass, what we've seen in removing of the lines in Georgia on almost a monthly basis, and what we've seen in Aleppo and Syria, it's clear that we have failed to find a partnership with Russia. So, point being that if we are going to be whole, free, at peace, and prosperous, we have to reestablish something with Russia. You pick the words that you would put together. Is it a cooperation? Is it an agreement? Is it, just pick the words, and then let's begin to define a future that gets us there. That's item one. Item two, how do we find ourselves to that future? There are methods. One of them is to jump from 0 to 100 miles an hour and hope it works. I don't believe in that. I don't believe in that. That train will go off the tracks, I think. What I believe is that we need to reestablish a series of communications and actions that build a trust relationship that lead to security. Security is the first ingredient required for prosperity. So, what are those places we start? Where are those small, measurable, observable starting points where we can communicate and accomplish something that the world can see? Why do I say measurable and objective? If we pick something that TASS is going to write one way and the Washington Post is going to write the other, we're right where we are now. We need to find things that the world can see, measure, observe, that the US and Russia, or NATO and Russia, accomplished these issues. It worked, and now they've moved to the next level. And so I believe we begin a building block movement where we take small steps that are measurable, observable, building communicative fabric and trust. When it works, move to a little higher endeavor. When it works, move to a little higher endeavor. And then over a space of time, it doesn't have to be 10 or 20 years, but over a space of time, we reestablish a trust relationship that the world can see, and now we can take on some of the more grand problems that are out there. But I think if we jump from 0 to grand problems, we'll fail. Secondarily, if we jump from 0 to a grand problem and we turn our back to Georgia, Crimea, Donbass, Aleppo, then we have legitimized Russian actions in Georgia, Crimea, Donbass, and Aleppo. And I don't sign up to that at all. We have to see communication, trust, good behavior, and then we move forward in an incremental way to a position where we can actually make change. So that's strategic direction east. And I would be happy to get my paper graded by some of the learned people in this audience. So let's look further south. As I mentioned before, the sort of arc of instability as it's been described in the south is problematic all the way from the Caspian around to Morocco. There's enough problems going on. Of course, all eyes now are sort of in the western deserts of Iraq and the eastern deserts and northern deserts of Syria. And what is happening there is horrid. My only personal experience is standing in Kahramanmaraş and looking across the border at what's going on down there. But it's an ugly sight. And the people and the human tragedy that's associated with this is nearly unspeakable. I believe, again, that this is just a symptom of a much larger problem. And 10 years ago, we may have described that problem as an Israeli-Palestinian problem. I think that would have been incorrect 10 years ago as well, but that may have been the way that we have seen it. I think this is a symptom of a larger Shia-Sunni problem. And that until we understand the dynamics of what people call Arab, Persian, Shia, Sunni, or however this works in the Middle East, will not really fix things. And my other assertion is that in Syria, Right now, we're applying one of our national powers almost exclusively, and I believe the answer really lies in the other three. If you would allow me to use a simple military model that fighter pilots need simple, repetitive things, we use this model called DIME, D-I-M-E, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. Those are sort of four rough baskets. There's lots of things under diplomatic, there's lots of things under information, fewer things, pretty clear what's under military, and then several types of tools under the economic. What I see happening in Syria is we're applying a big M and tiny D, I, and E. In an unbalanced approach, we're whacking a mole in the deserts of Syria and Iraq. We could be whacking that mole for the next 40 years if we don't fix the root problems that cause this in that area. And I believe that's where there's a lot of work to be done. How do we solve the problem of a generation of young people who will never expect to have a job and never expect to marry and have a family? And then Daesh comes along and offers them money and a spouse. How are we going to fix this problem if we don't address at the same time the societal issues that are the root causes of this problem? And so I would argue that we need a military component because all progress starts first with a secure environment. But we need, in this problem, in my opinion, much bigger DIs and Es than we need Ms. And I'll leave you to the Q&A to challenge me on that one. This is the result, of course. This is a problem for us in multiple levels. It is clear what you see in front of you is a huge problem, and it's a disgrace, honestly. There are millions, nearly 1 million in Jordan, over 1 million in Turkey, and then almost that many heading into or already into Europe. There are millions of refugees out there, and I would opine that most of them are legitimate refugees, legitimate people who deserve our help, and there needs to be an answer for. The sad news is that embedded in this refugee flow are also 3 other classes of people. I feel first, criminality. There are people that are just getting rich off of what's happening here. Second, there are clearly terrorists. They have found their way already to our doorsteps in Europe and to some degree here in America. And oh, by the way, it's coming here. It's going to get way worse before it gets better, in my opinion. Way worse before it gets better. And then last are a class I call foreign fighters. Why do I select them differently than terrorists? Because I believe there are foreign fighters who left their nation that wanted to go fight for their religion. They have finished that, they're going home. And they're not a terrorist right now, but they could be. When they get back home, if that nation does not meet their needs, if it does not address their concerns, that foreign fighter will probably become a terrorist. If that foreign fighter returns home and sees a nation that's addressing the societal problems that caused them to leave in the first place, maybe we save that foreign fighter from becoming a terrorist. So I split them out differently there. So what do we do about this? And I think I've sort of given it away. If we continue to only send military forces to this part of the world, we'll see the same thing happen in this part of the world that we saw in Afghanistan. We went to Afghanistan and we whacked the mole really hard. And what did it do? It squirted out to the deserts of Syria and Iraq and to North Africa. And we're whacking this mole really hard right now in Syria and Iraq. And it's already squirting out to Libya and other places in northern Africa. Ungoverned spaces, some of it going back to ungoverned spaces in Afghanistan that we've already bought with blood and treasure. If all we're going to do is whack moles, we're going to have lots of moles to whack. My argument is that we need to adopt the other tools of our government, D, diplomatically, I, informationally, and E, economically, to begin to address the root causes of this problem. And that will be the way that we stop it. Military application is needed to provide security. Nothing good really happens without security. But it needs to be much more balanced in the approach. That's Phil Breedlove's opinion. And I offered my opinion to a lot of senior leadership at this school to say that I think we have all the right people at this school to think about every piece of the DIME. In the Sam Nunn School, we talk D and I all the time. We have information people in our cyber and in our electronic computing that can help us fight that fight. And we have people in the Scheller College that can work on the E. And oh, by the way, a lot of E starts in places like civil engineering, where one of the most basic requirements is clean water, sanitation, road and railroad infrastructure in order to provide business opportunity. I think right here at this college, you can take a multifunctional look at this and actually work a grand problem and a grand set of thoughts for this right here with the 3 colleges I just talked about. So I told you with fighter pilots, repetition is a good thing. This is what I really want you to take away from today. This is my get off the stage slide. In strategic direction east, I think it starts with a relationship or whatever word you choose. Whatever word you choose. Dialogue that ends up in mutual good behavior that leads to trust, and then trust that starts a secure environment, but most importantly, can lead to prosperity, and I think prosperity can answer many of society's issues that cause our problems with Russia. And the same in the South. Start with a secure environment, balance it with a broad approach in DI&E to get at the root causes. Give young people a chance in their future and a place to live safely and have a future. And I think you cut off a lot of the root causes for what we see in strategic direction south. Okay. I think that's my last slide. If you can't tell, I'm passionate about this. So.
All right, with not so passionate, you took all the time. So we have about 20 minutes for questions.
I'm a helicopter pilot, so my checklists are a little more complex. If Putin does to one of the Baltic states, one or more of the Baltic states, what he has done in Ukraine, what should we do, what could we do, and what would we do?
It's an incredibly good question, and one we were talking about before I left, and they're talking about now. This issue of a hybrid war from underneath. The tough part is first recognizing that it's happening, because there are a lot of proud nations that said not happening here. We're in full control. We're good. First is recognizing it, and then once you recognize it, you have to determine, is this a legitimate movement like the Maidan, or is this an illegitimate movement being sponsored by an exterior threat? That's going to be important to all the rest of NATO. It's less important to you because it's happening to your nation one way or the other. But if you're going to get help from NATO, one of the first questions NATO is going to ask is that a legitimate political movement? And if it is, it's not appropriate for us to be involved. So seeing it, recognizing it, determining whether it is authentic in that it is a normal political movement, or second, is it supported by an exterior person? If you can prove that it's an exterior source, that's one of the first things we need to do, and I'll talk about that in a minute. If you can prove it's an exterior source, then you can go to Article 4 and then Article 5 and get help from NATO. And from there on out, it's pretty clear. I love the words that our president used. We will defend every inch of NATO territory. the art and science of being able to recognize and then to show decisively that this is an exterior problem put upon us by someone from the outside. That's where we have a lot of work to do. Our intelligence communities in those nations are much like ours was here 10 years ago. Some of them are better than others, but the intelligence forces and the legal forces and the policing forces don't always communicate well in some of the smaller, newer nations. The bigger, older nations, they get it. Old NATO, I would say, gets it pretty good, but many of the former Warsaw Pact nations have yet to build this connective tissue that helps them prepare for recognizing and then characterizing what kind it is and then reporting that convincingly. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Yes, ma'am.
Can you explain a little more what you mean when you say you think it's, in terms of the refugee crisis, it's going to get worse? Just the nature of that worse? Do you feel that there will be increasing numbers of dangerous classes of refugees? Or
Yeah, I miscommunicated there. What I was talking about was terrorism is going to get worse before it gets better. The refugee crisis it's on a rheostat. If Russia picks another Aleppo to start bombing, and Assad picks another Aleppo-sized city to start bombing, we'll have more refugees. I mean, it's very straightforward. It's almost a linear relationship for engineers between where they're applying pressure and how many refugees we have. What I was talking about is the terrorist problem is going to get worse before it gets better. Part of it is because we're having success. The French are having success in North Africa. We are having success primarily in Iraq, some success beginning in northern Syria, south of the border of Turkey. When you have success, they're going to squirt out somewhere else. And a lot of them are going to go home because they enjoy a whole lot more protections in our civil societies than they do where they're at. And then my other reference was not to be alarmist, but I was speaking to us as Americans. Those of you who are Americans, and there are some non-Americans in the audience. But I think it's going to get a lot worse in America before it gets better. We're on the leading edge of what I see in America.
In the north, with respect to NATO, what happens when Russia moves into Latvia and we're supposed to support our brothers up there and Turkey says no?
Well, first of all, as you know, very few people understand that in Article 5, if you read it closely, it's about collective defense, but there's also a bilateral agreement that every nation of the alliance is committed to the bilateral support of the oppressed nation. So a decision that NATO writ large would be involved could be held up by one nation. But the other 27 nations still have a bilateral responsibility according to Article 5 of the Atlantic Treaty that they will come to the response. So what you would see in that case is there's a lot of nations that would respond. For instance, right now in Latvia, there's 5 large nations who have troops in Latvia. And you better believe those 5 are going to be in there protecting their men and women. So I don't have some of the fears that others have, which is that nothing will happen. I think that what you will see is under Article 5, nations will respond as NATO makes its decision. Our current president could not have been more clear. We will defend every inch of NATO territory. Yes, sir.
What about just outside NATO, Ossetia, places like that?
Yeah.
Where Russia has had an eye on it since pre-Tsar times.
Yeah, South Ossetia, they already have. They're there. Yeah. So, well, that is Georgia, I think. South Ossetia is Georgia in my mind, and so is Abkhazia. No matter that there's Russians on top of it, those are Georgian territory. So Russia is there now, and the question that you're asking is the larger question of, we used to call them gray states. People don't like that connotation, so now we call them the nations between Russia and NATO. The sad news is that we have no treaty obligations in some cases with those. We had some interesting obligations with Ukraine, but there is there is no declaratory policy about what our nation or any of the NATO nations will do in response to that, with the exception of the following. For those nations which already have an active conflict on their soil, like Georgia, like Ukraine, they will not be brought into NATO. That is written into the NATO policy. You have to resolve those internal conflicts before they can be considered to be brought into NATO, and ergo given a defensive posture. And that, I think, is part of Russia's whole reason for being in Georgia and Ukraine. It's their pocket veto, if you will allow me, because they know as long as there's an active incursion, NATO won't bring that nation in. That's one of the reasons when you're asked, I am an unabashed apologetic for the Georgians. Their troops served alongside of us under my command for a while in Afghanistan, just like American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, without any caveat. They never asked anything except for where are we going? And they served just like our people. On a per capita basis, if the United States had lost the number of soldiers that Georgia has lost on a per capita basis, it would be staggering. They have taken a heavy toll for their participation. I think they have, in a military sense, have earned every right to be a part of NATO, but they will not be for a while because they have an active incursion in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Yes, sir.
We lived in Houston for a long time. My backdoor neighbor was from Jordan, and we've been in the U.S. a good long time. And I said, Mahmoud, what do we not understand about life there? And he said, oh, that's easy. We hate each other. It's tribal. It's thousands of years old. And America thinks you can solve it with money and the form of your government, which is kind of a same related thing you were talking about in Sunni, and certainly that manifested itself in left Iraq, right, with who got in charge, and how do the nations of the world help improve that? Clearly, we've lots of examples of that didn't work. Don't do more of that.
So I apologize to some of our European friends in here, but the lines we drew on this earth in the last century are not helpful. I mean, just think of what's happening in eastern Turkey, western Iran, northern Iraq, and northeastern Syria with the Kurds. Those lines across that desert mean absolutely nothing to them, except for this makes this painful for me to be a Kurd and be recognized for what I'm doing. So he has it exactly right. My example was northeast of Jalalabad, being in one valley, and I was trying to solve a problem of some folks in another valley, and I was talking to the people in this one valley. They had no idea who I was talking about or why it would be important to them. And in America, that's like 30 miles apart. Heck, the high school football teams would be playing each other. But there they were completely separate and had never really heard of or concerned themselves with the people one ridge over. And we don't get that. We don't understand that. And the tribal piece is a big part of that. Those two communities we were working with on the opposite side of an almost 10,000-foot ridge, so it was fairly imposing. But they were concerned about their strong man who was leading their little unit that was feeding them, clothing them, and protecting them, and they didn't really have a big concern about the guys on the other side of the ridge. So there's a lot of things about how they do business there that we just flat don't get. Yes. Yeah. We always want to impress our form of business on other folks. I won't even start here because I don't think we have enough time to talk about whether our form of democracy is right. I don't think there are a lot of people in that part of the world really believe our particular form of democracy is what they need. I'll dodge that. There's so many, you pick it next.
What do you think of the European amount of budget that is spending for militarizing their countries? Is that truly not enough? Should they pay more?
So I would say two things here. First of all, before our election, we were on a path based on Wales and then Warsaw. I thought we were on a reasonable path and a reasonable vector for nations to get to a better place on their spending. Of course, what has happened in our election has positively affected some of that, but is causing a lot of angst, clearly. Here's the other piece that I like to support our NATO allies in that is sometimes not received well in the United States. There's a lot of intangibles that these nations are doing. Think about what the French are doing in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. All of that's addressing problems that we would have to deal with in Europe if they weren't addressed in North Africa. Think about the following. Post the tragedy of losing our ambassador and several other great people, we have created a force that rapidly reacts all around the Mediterranean. This is a uniquely American thing, not a NATO thing. We have created an in extremis force that is there to respond to these kind of problems in North Africa. That force is actually stationed at Morón in Spain. But that's a long way from, say, Tunisia or the eastern deserts of Libya. So we routinely move portions of that force. It's primarily a Marine force. It's an Air Force and Marine force. We routinely move that all around the Gulf, from Greece, sometimes even portions of it in Turkey, Greece, Spain, Italy. We just move it around. And they allow us to do this on almost 48 hours notice, moving people and stuff around. So let's just imagine if you were the governor of Florida, Alabama, Texas, and Louisiana, and a foreign government came in here and said, we're going to put about 1,000 people in aircraft over here, and we're going to move them around inside of your 4 states every 48 hours. How do you think that will work with those governors? Wouldn't happen. So what I'm trying to say is there are intangible things that these nations give, basing overflight rights, support, intelligence support, and other things that I think the common person in America doesn't understand. And so, yes, I believe there needs to be investment in our readiness and responsiveness across the board in NATO. Yes. But I also think that NATO, United States, needs to sit back and understand that there are intangible contributions that many of these nations make. And we need to give them a little credit for that, in my opinion.
Do you think the Europeans are spending enough by 2% of that?
So if a couple of our larger European friends spent 2%, that would be huge. That would be, I'm trying to use funny words from the past 4 months. That would be huge. It would be really big because they have huge economies. For the smaller nations, 2%, it really doesn't make a huge difference in the end game. But the point is we're all in this together. It's 28 for 28. We agreed at Wales and then we agreed at Warsaw that we're going to spend 2% and that we're going to raise the readiness and responsiveness of the entire force. And I think that's incredibly important.
So the failed coup d'etat in Turkey, a NATO member, may have changed Turkish objectives in the region. How will NATO and the United States deal with that?
So let me just challenge a little bit your assertion. I'm not sure that it changed anything in Turkey. It just accelerated a predetermined course. The coup d'etat, we don't support that. You know we don't. It's not the right answer. And I have many friends there that are out of jail and at least a couple of dozen that are in jail. We don't support that, period. But I think more concerning to us is the direction that the government has been taking for some time now. You make your own judgment on where the Erdogan government is headed. It's concerning. And as concerning now as we used to have a very functioning educational system that's been eviscerated. We used to have a very functioning military system that's been eviscerated, and to some degree, some policing functions that have been eviscerated. So a great ally sitting in an incredibly tough neighborhood, Syria, Iraq to their south, Iran to their east, and Russia and the Black Sea to their north. We got an incredibly important ally sitting in a tough place, and we need to help them in the ways they need to find their way forward, I think. Does that answer? I'm dodging a couple of the more. I'm not going to go political here.
What would that help look like?
Well, first of all, they are still an ally in NATO, and they're in a tough part of the world. And I think we need to politically find a common approach to northern Syria. Right now, we don't have a common approach in northern Syria. That would be first. Help them staunch the flow of refugees that's causing a huge part of the problem in other parts of Europe. And so this is not, again, sort of like the other thing. We find small successes and build on them. We don't walk in the door with, here's the grand strategy, take it or leave it. And we try to work with an ally to find a path together ahead in that problem, I think.
Maybe we took a group of questions.
Yeah, I need to write then so that I don't get lost.
Okay, now, hey, Zachary,
Make them real quick, and I'll try to make them real quick.
We'll start off with those three.
I'm curious as to what kind of actions you think it'll take specifically, at least on our side, to build the mutual good behavior relationship between NATO and Russia. How do we make that a reality, I guess, in the historical and current context?
Gotcha.
You suggest building a relationship with Russia, and then you said to incrementally build onto it. That in political science jargon, as you know, is functionalism, and hoping for spillover in other areas. That makes me wonder, has your time in Europe made you think in those terms, or would you have proposed similar things prior to having become secretary?
Do I get to choose which ones I don't answer?
That's the beauty of collecting them. You can answer some and not others. Zachary?
You spoke a little bit on French success in old French Africa, French North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. What would you say has been like the balance of French intervention as far as the dime? How has the M been in relation to the DI
In North Africa?
in North Africa?
Yeah.
Want some more?
Yeah, let's take maybe two more.
Okay, all the way in the back.
Could you speak to the issue of potential for establishing safe zones in Syria, Iraq, to the diaspora?
I will answer that one. I've answered it 3 times in testimony.
Softball, I guess. How does a Georgia Tech grad become the general?
That's easy.
What you probably don't know is that the number 2 military position in the nation is the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And my roommate while I was here went to that position. For 3 years, Admiral Sandy Winnefeld and I were in the same fraternity and slept about 4 inches apart. And he went on to be the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and I went on to be the SACEUR. Okay, so where to start with Russia? There's a whole bunch of ideas out there. In fact, Senator Nunn brought up a great one this morning. Both our nations are worried about loose fissile material and the idea of a dirty bomb as opposed to an advanced weapon, and that terrorists understand this dynamic, and a dirty bomb in Moscow is just like a dirty bomb in Washington, D.C. That's an area we could start on. I think that the U.S. and Russia have a thing called the Ink Sea. It was built for maritime only. It has morphed into maritime, air, and land. Ink Sea stands for incidents at sea. We come together and talk about incidents at land, sea, and air now. We just keep calling it Ink Sea. They refuse to do that with NATO. I think we should try to figure out how to do that in a NATO. There's about 7 or 8 substantive things that I would call baby steps. We get some baby steps, then we move to some adolescent steps. Then we move to some teenager steps, then we move to some, you get the gist. So there's any number, and if you've got some ideas, I'm taking all suggestions because I'm going to probably get another chance to talk with the folks that are coming into power, and I hope to give them some. They're going to hear something just like this, by the way. Oh, okay. Let me see. I'm dodging one. My approach did change after being in NATO. Yeah. I am used to dealing with military men and women and making decisions in a military context. And we have a structure to that. And it's the same in almost every military. It may be a little this way or that, but I'm used to that. And I had to learn how to do things politically in NATO with 28 bosses. And I likened it to soup. We often had a problem. We needed a pot of soup. And in the end, we always had a pot of soup. And sometimes this ingredient was bigger than that ingredient, and this one's ill was taken care of more than this one's ill. But in the end, the soup always tasted good, and we moved on with it. So I had to learn how things are done politically, and it was quite an education. And so, yes, I have changed the way I try to approach problems such that we can find our way to something verifiable. I hate it when something happens and you get Sputnik and RT on one side and the Washington Post on the other, and who knows what really happened. We need to find out how to do measurable, objective, observable things to move us down this path. So yes, it has changed. Safe zone in Syria. The hard part about a safe zone in Syria is that all safe zones start with an act of war. If we were to establish a safe zone in northern Syria, we'd either have to have the absolute promise from the Syrians and the Russians that they would not come in there and bomb or do anything, because a safe zone has to be defended. The first thing we do when we establish a safe zone is bomb all the surface-to-air missile sites in that area and farther back away from the area to preclude overlap into the area. And we bomb any forces that could attack our people or our aircraft. So safe zones, people need to remember, start with an act of war. We bomb the enemy upon whom we are imposing a safe zone. Unless you have an ironclad approval of the people you're establishing that zone over, you have to take out their ability to defend their area. If you go in there and make an agreement and then someone shoots down a German, French, British, US aircraft full of young men and women, now we have a huge problem. So safe zones first begin with an act of war. And are we ready to do that? If we are, we can absolutely establish a safe zone. Militarily, we absolutely understand how to do it, and it can be done. I'll leave it to the politicians to decide, does it solve the problem? I'd rather not enter into that fray because that's going to be a major conversation here not too long. And then GT to SACEUR. Well, you may not believe this, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. After 39 years in the military, if I see a young person that walks up to me as a lieutenant and says, I want to be the Chief of Staff of the Army, or I want to be the SACEUR, or I want to be the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I would say, run, do not walk away from that person. Because they are concerned about the wrong thing, absolutely the wrong thing. As a young person, and this sounds very terrible, but it's the truth. As a young F-16 fighter pilot, I wanted to be the most effective and efficient killing machine in the service of my nation, because that's what I was being paid to do. And so I focused on my individual fighting skills. Later in life, you start leading other young soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And now your job is to take care of them so that they can do their job. And so your focus changes to taking care of the people left and right and behind you so that they get home and they can do their job. And then once you get good at that, you start, unfortunately, moving back away from the fight and commanding at every level. And every time, it's really about giving your troops a clear mission, providing them all the kit and skills they need to do their job, and then letting them do their job and taking care of what happens afterwards. And if you find a young man or a woman, and I have 2 sons-in-law and a daughter wearing the cloth of this nation now, but if you find a young man or a woman that's what they're worried about, now you got somebody to stand behind. And so I never thought I would get to where I was. I just did my job. I went every place my nation sent me. And later in life, I took care of my troops as hard as I could take care of them. And much later in life, 3 times I commanded joint operations where I had to take care of soldiers, sailors, and Marines as well. And that is the greatest thing that has ever happened to me in my life, is taking care of those young troopers, because you don't know how good they are and how great they are in roles. When their nation asks them to do their dirty work, they're extremely good at it. When their nation asks them to do things that are not dirty work, they put their passion into it. They're really good at that. I wish if I'd known I was going to have this question, I would show you a picture of a young Norwegian female sergeant bent over and helping an Afghan woman in the northeast of the country. And the look on that Afghan woman's face, first, to have a female soldier taking care of her who she could talk to, and the look of trust between those two would tell you the story I'm trying to tell, which is they're really good at doing what we hire them to do. They're also really good at doing all the other things the nation asks them to do. And if you find somebody that wants to help young men and women do that, that's the person you want to stand next to. You find somebody that wants to be a SACEUR, run.
Thank you.